Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you, Antje Ziemer and Berlin State Library for inviting me to the Cross Asia Talks and to give me the opportunity to talk about motherhood and the different roles of mothers in a Tibetan Buddhist context. Just a few weeks ago, I attended a reading by Eastern European female poets. When asked why there are so few female poets, they responded that women become invisible after marriage. They have to look after the household and the children, all seemingly quite natural, and take themselves back, making them invisible. This made me think of this lecture and my topic because the same can be said of women in Tibetan Buddhist texts. They are rarely mentioned and appear almost invisible. During my studies in Munich, we read a wide variety of texts from different Buddhist traditions. In the beginning, I didn't think anything of the fact that women were rarely mentioned in the texts. At the time, my focus was clearly on learning classical Tibetan. Next slide, please. My first field trip in 2010 took me to Sikkim in northern India. I had an untranslated Tibetan text in my pocket written about a Buddhist master who traveled to Sikkim in the 17th century. He worked there at a time when Sikkim was open for Buddhism, shortly after the enthronement of the first Sikkimese king. I found all of this very exciting, especially when I found evidence of this historical figure and rediscovered landscape features described in the centuries-old text, even though there was no information about him or his tradition in the common cultural memory of Sikkim. During my time in Sikkim, I was told repeatedly that this master could not be part of the official history. They argued that according to their history, masters from the Nyingma tradition were active in Sikkim, but no one from this master's tradition. But in some villages, people still remembered that this Buddhist master acted and lived there centuries ago. Why do I tell you this? Next slide. I mentioned cultural memory. So the concept of cultural memory was defined by Jan Assmann as a form of collective memory in the sense that it is shared by a number of people and that it conveys to these people a collective that is cultural identity and that preserves the store of knowledge from which a group derives an awareness of its unity and peculiarity. So you see, what becomes part of the so-called cultural memory? What is remembered through time? Is it knowledge of and about women, mothers, nuns? Is there awareness about their lives and deeds? I would say no. This kind of information is not collectively remembered. And I tell you this for a second reason. During my research project in Sikkim, I experienced an aha moment that shaped my subsequent work. Next slide. Like many scholars before me, I followed in the footsteps of renowned Buddhist masters. One of them you see here. And I visited monasteries connected with them. Even years later, when I returned to conduct further research, I continued to focus on the monks of this tradition. However, observations that I made during my trips made me reflect years later. The Babyuk monastery is home to several monks belonging to the Barawa Kagyu tradition. During my visits, young monks were playing in the meadow in front of the monastery. Some monks were standing together chatting, so the monks were viscerally present to visitors. Next slide. In one corner, however, out of sight, I found a small building where nuns were sitting close together and reciting Buddhist texts. During my visits, I only saw the nuns in their small hut. Throughout my years of research into this Buddhist tradition, the Barawa Kagyu, I have never come across any written or oral information about nunneries or any kind of places for nuns belonging to it. Yes, there were mentions of nuns, and some information about a few women is recorded in the biographies of this tradition. While monasteries are regularly mentioned in the texts with descriptions, people who lived and acted there, I found no mention of places for nuns. This frustrated me, given that there have always been practicing nuns, but it seemed as if they had been placed out of sight, somewhere in the background, both literally and metaphorically. This has actually been happening for centuries, not only to nuns, but to mothers and women in general. In this context, the concept of colonization of knowledge seems important. Who decides what gets written down and remembered? Who is worthy enough to be mentioned? This reproduction of a male-dominated historiography is a form of colonization, namely colonization of knowledge. In order to make women heard, knowledge needs to be decolonized. Colonization is not only talked about when it comes to national territory expansions. A much more subtle kind of colonization takes place when topics are not given a say or selective knowledge is imparted. Looking back, I can't believe how blind I was to this issue for so long. This makes the work of raising the profile of women and giving them a voice all the more important to me today. And that's also a reason why I've been writing this German language blog now for over 3 years. I mentioned the Barawa Kagyu tradition. Despite playing a significant role in Tibet, Bhutan, and the wider Himalayan region since the 14th century, this Buddhist tradition of the Barawa Kagyu has received little attention. I have been publishing articles on this tradition, and I have also published a book on the subject in 2017 entitled The Barawa Kagyu, Historical and Contemporary Studies. Next slide. To provide some context, the Barawa Kagyu tradition is one of the many Tibetan Buddhist traditions grouped together as Kagyupa. The expression Kagyupa refers to the orally transmitted tantric teachings which are passed from teacher to disciple. This board features most, but not all, of the Kagyu traditions. The Barawa Kagyu, on which I am working, is just one of them. The term Kagyupa summarizes several lineages going back to Gampopa, the disciple of the famous Milarepa. The Kagyupa tradition is divided into 4 major and 8 minor branches or traditions. One of the 8 minor traditions is the one of the Drukpa Kagyupa, which was further subdivided and eventually developed the Barawa Kagyu tradition. While they all share central teachings, for example on Mahamudra and yogic practice, they differ in terms of transmission and incarnation lines, as well as meditation experience, as a high-ranking Barawa monk told me. Next slide. Here you see a map with the most important places connected with the Barawa tradition. The tradition was founded in Tibet, in the Shang Valley, spread to Bhutan and Sikkim, and later to Himachal Pradesh in India. However, the more I explored this tradition and the more texts I read, the clearer it became to me that even though the texts were written about men, they still contain information about women and mothers. However, it is sometimes necessary to read between the lines or even outside them. It's like a puzzle, but with a little patience, the pieces can be put together to form a picture. Next slide. So, motherhood is a complex and highly ambivalent role for women. It becomes even more complicated when the roles of mothers are looked into through a religious lens. This applies also to the image of motherhood in Tibetan Buddhism. From a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, women are expected to be loving and caring mothers, ideally to all sentient beings. At the same time, being a mother means placing obstacles on one's spiritual path. Motherhood takes place between love and compassion, but also involves challenges, disappointments, and hardships. Next slide. Mothers have been portrayed in very different ways in relation to a Buddhist tradition. These depictions include idealized representations of the conception, pregnancy, and giving birth to a Buddhist master, obstacles to childbirth, and challenges connected with motherhood, and Buddhist nuns who became mothers. I would also like to ask whether male and female authors differ in the way to which mothers are described in their texts, and what aspects of motherhood they address. A mother is usually the first and most significant influence in a child's life, providing nourishment and care. The idea of a caring mother, as well as motherhood in general, is often considered a social ideal for women. This was also the case in Tibetan Buddhist societies, where women were expected to become loving wives and mothers who gave birth, ideally, to sons. Furthermore, motherhood is also a metaphor in a Buddhist context for how sentient beings should treat another, namely like a mother, but also to love all sentient beings as if they were our mothers. I would like to share a brief anecdote from my fieldwork. While walking with a Tibetan monk, we came across a cat. He swore softly, which irritated me. Noticing my reaction, he said, you are right. This is also a sentient being. Who knows, perhaps it is my past mother. We should treat every sentient being as if they were our mother. However, motherhood is by no means always a blessing. It can also be challenging or even burdensome, from painful pregnancies and difficult births to the loss of children and the attachments that can hinder a mother's Buddhist journey. The role and influence of mothers can be very different. Some are extremely loving and caring, while others are absent, dismissive, or even frightening. Regardless of their impact on their children, however, mothers have a lasting influence on their lives. Depiction of mothers and description of motherhood can also be found in biographies and hagiographies of Tibetan Buddhist masters. So hagiographies were written to inspire readers or listeners and provide a model for spiritual path. The origin of a Buddhist master played a notable role, including the naming of the parents. These texts also provide information about the roles that mothers played in the lives of the masters in question. In this context, different stories and details were recorded and reproduced. While many hagiographies depict mothers in an idealized manner, portraying them as possessing positive qualities and connecting them with supernatural events surrounding the birth of a Buddhist master, some accounts of negative experiences have also been preserved. Before focusing on mothers from the Barawa Kagyu tradition, I would like to share two examples of what motherhood could mean. These examples are from people belonging to other Tibetan Buddhist traditions, but I think they are important to mention. The first example is that of a yogi from Ladakh. In his autobiography, he recounts how his mother died during childbirth. Consequently, his father remarried a woman who this yogi described as arrogant and proud. The yogi even wished for his stepmother to die so that his suffering might end. By the way, Petra Maurer worked on that yogi. And another example of negative memories of a mother is that of a nun from Tölpo, a region in northern Nepal close to Tibet. Her parents had longed for a son. Therefore, when she was born, they were highly disappointed. This was reflected in her name, Tilok, meaning happiness dashed. As a result, her mother became depressed and regularly took out her anger on her daughter by yelling at her and physically abusing her. Curtis Schaeffer wrote a book about this nun. So these two examples are not from the Barawa tradition, but show the ambivalent description and even roles that a mother might have also in a Buddhist context. These two negative descriptions are of a stepmother and a mother whose child was a daughter and not a son. By contrast, the mothers of Buddhist masters were consistently portrayed positively in the hagiographies of the Barawa tradition. Next slide. So how did I gather information about mothers from the Barawa Kagyu? Although there are no independent biographies of any of the mothers connected to the Barawa tradition, information was gathered from Tibetan, Sikkimese and Bhutanese sources. I analyzed 32 short biographies and 17 hagiographies of Barawa masters for information on their mothers. You can see excerpts from some of these texts here. The most important sources were a collection called Kagyu Serdrang Gemmo. The original manuscripts are in possession of a Barawa family from Kirong in Tibet, now living in North India, and historical writings from the Trukpa Kagyu published around 10 years ago. Both collections contain hagiographies and autobiographies of important Barawa figures. Information was also collected from other texts, including religious songs and cultural histories. Next slide. This overview shows which texts mention which mother. In total, information on 13 mothers was available for this study. Mothers of renowned Barawa masters. This is important to keep in mind because there are no accounts of the mothers of daughters connected to the Barawa tradition. Exploring the challenges and hardships they faced, their relationships with each other, and how these shaped the lives of daughters and mothers in relation to motherhood would be interesting. Although there are records of a few Barawa women, information on their respective own mothers is lacking. Despite accounts of ordinary girls and their mothers, that is to say, those who were not religiously privileged, would be informative, but these are also unavailable. While most of these mothers were only mentioned briefly in the sources consulted, a few texts deal with the stages of their lives in more detail. Next slide. What could I learn from the available texts written on Buddhist masters about their mothers, the role of mothers, the societal expectations placed on mothers and motherhood in general? As you can see here, I created different categories based on what I looked for in the texts, what I found in, between, and outside the lines. Overall, the text provided insight into disappointments and difficulties women experienced in their lives. They provided insights into different social, religious roles connected to motherhood. They addressed the challenges that women have faced and probably still face in becoming and being a mother, set against the backdrop of societal expectations. And they provided insights into the experiences of women who were both a mother and a Buddhist nun. Next slide. I will now present you some of my results and will start with a challenging topic: disappointments and difficulties experienced before childbirth. It is now widely accepted that on average 1 in 3 women will experience a miscarriage at some point in their lives. Miscarriage is an extremely traumatic experience that can leave a lasting mark. Even today, it remains a major taboo subject. Many women believe that they are alone when something like this happens to them because the topic receives too little attention. Other traumatic experiences include stillbirth or the death of a child during birth. However, such events are also referenced in centuries-old texts from the Barawa tradition. As I mentioned earlier, my first field research in Sikkim, when I was there, I translated a Tibetan text about a 17th century Barawa master named Könchok Gyaltsen. In the text itself, we read about his mother. We learn that she lost 3 children at birth, apparently because they did not come out, which could indicate various complications. After these losses, however, she became pregnant with Könchok Gyaltsen, the Buddhist master I mentioned, and gave birth to him. As he was born feet first, a more difficult birth, his birth was interpreted as a special omen. He indeed became an important Barawa master, introducing the Barawa teachings to Sikkim and starting the Barawa lineage of the Kagyu, an incarnation lineage which is still upheld to this day. So grief and pain are considered to be hindering emotions on the religious path. In this respect, motherhood can sometimes be a hindrance, despite being socially expected. This may explain, or at least provide an explanation for, why being born as a male is considered more auspicious than being born as a female. In hagiographical writings, references to the mother were often made in relation to her giving birth to a special child, rather than providing personal information about her. The good qualities of Buddhist masters were reflected in the circumstances surrounding their birth. In this way, some information about the mothers was recorded and preserved. The mother of Könchok Gyaltsen, for example, lost her children before he was born, and she was described as having many positive qualities. She was portrayed as an expert in Buddhist teachings, with great knowledge and compassion. She was also described as someone who took care of the poor, embodying the ideals of a devout Buddhist practitioner. Interestingly, despite learning a few things about her, her name is not mentioned in any of the surviving texts. Next slide. I will give you a few more examples of how mothers were described. One mother was described as a person who achieved great spiritual attainment and was endowed with many good qualities. A mother who was faithful, merciful, and kind to all beings. Another mother was depicted as diligent, intelligent, and compassionate. Furthermore, 5 mothers were described enjoying good health and a peaceful mind during their pregnancy with a Barawa master. Of course, this can be interpreted as a way of legitimizing a special child in a religious context. Overall, these descriptions emphasize the uniqueness of the child and honor the expected social religious role of a mother who is loving and compassionate towards all sentient beings. However, some mothers' descriptions stand out. The issue of legitimization is no longer the only consideration, and I will give you 2 examples. The following mothers who supported and encouraged their sons in their religious lives are striking, as their actions were considered important enough to be recorded. Next slide. The first mother I will present you is the nun Kungatsom. No one back? Yeah. No, you have yeah, okay. So the first mother I will present you is the nun Kungatsom, who lived in the 15th century. She is mentioned repeatedly in her son's biography, as well as emphasizing her outstanding personal and maternal qualities. The focus is on their shared travels, charitable work, and her passing away. Wherever they went, she took care of those in need. When she felt seriously ill, her son returned to care for her. When reading this text, it is immediately apparent that the tone in which the mother is described is different from that in other Barawa texts. She is mentioned more often and described in greater detail as an important person, a practicing nun, and not just as a mother of a Buddhist master. Remarkably, this is the only Barawa hagiography to be composed by a woman. Whether the mother was mentioned so often because the female authorship, or whether a male author would have set similar priorities, remain an open but interesting question. Next slide. The second example is that of Sangye children. Before her marriage, she was a nun. The family she married into was influential in the Shang Valley, the region where the Barawa tradition was founded. When her son was about 3 years old, a devastating drought struck their home region. Her husband had been responsible for performing the necessary rituals, but he was in Bhutan at that time. It was Sangye children, the mother, who convinced the community that her son, her 3-year-old son, displayed the signs necessary to make it rain. Following her intervention, the monks and her son performed rituals and it rained for 7 days. Next slide. Now let's move on to the next part of the puzzle, the challenges of motherhood. As I mentioned earlier, motherhood can be very challenging. Some of these were considered significant enough to be recorded in historical texts. But what happens when mothers die young? The challenges of motherhood include giving birth to a healthy child, helping the child survive infancy, and surviving birth and the postnatal period. This is by no means guaranteed. As Sienna Craig states, the high maternal and infant mortality rates in culturally Tibetan communities serve as painful, embodied reminders of the first noble truth of Buddhism, the truth of suffering. End of quote. The analyzed sources tell the stories of different mothers who did not die in childbirth, but rather while still caring for young children. As the sources describe, this brought changes and also challenges for the bereaved children and their families. Two texts mentioned that the loss of a mother was painful, both emotionally and economically, as there was suddenly one fewer person available for work. Next slide. One mother called Babmo lived in the 15th century, and another one was called Betsin, lived in the 18th century. So following Babmo's death, the family struggled to pay compulsory labor taxes. At the time of Betsin's death, her son was only around 3 years old. This was a very difficult time for the father and son due to the taxes they had to pay. With the death of these two women, their family lost precious members of the workforce who were needed to pay their taxes. Therefore, as well as being loving wives and mothers, women were also valuable and necessary workers within the family. Next slide. Some women rejected the traditional gender roles and became nuns, but still became mothers. Getting pregnant as a nun was certainly a special circumstance, and a pregnant nun would have faced many challenges. As women were generally considered inferior and especially intellectually inferior to men, nuns had to face derogatory comments. Overall, women were seen as more susceptible to temptation, a widely held belief in Tibet. The lives of different women demonstrate the possibility of becoming both a mother and a nun during one lifetime. Some became nuns after losing a child, some after their children were born and survived, and some were already nuns when they gave birth, as previously mentioned. As the Barawa sources reveal, 2 women were already nuns when they gave birth to a Barawa master, the already mentioned Küngatsam and Anne Mönlam. Next slide. The nun Küngatsam lived in the 15th century. She became pregnant by a fully ordained monk. As previously mentioned, she played an important role in her son's life until her death and was described regularly in her son's biography. Anne Mönlam had already entered religious life by the time she became pregnant. She was described as a faithful and diligent woman who had a prophetic dream that she would give birth to the Barawa Tulku, an important incarnation lineage within the Barawa Kagyu. The father of this Tulku is not named, only that he was a realized yogi. This time, the name of the mother seemed more important to write it down. Getting pregnant as a nun was certainly a difficult decision and a significant challenge. How did the respective communities react to this? Were the nuns offended or stigmatized? What was everyday and spiritual life like for a mother who was also a nun? Unfortunately, the consulted texts do not provide any information on this. Next slide. The lives of mothers are filled with both joy and challenges, disappointments and hardships. They must navigate the complexities of societal and religious expectations as well as the realities of everyday life and the diverse experiences that come with becoming a mother. Traditionally, women were expected to be loving and self-sacrificing mothers to all living beings. However, motherhood was also considered an obstacle to spiritual development as it was often associated with attachment and tragic events, such as the death of a child. The analyzed sources contain hagiographies and other religious texts depicting male Buddhist practitioners rather than the autobiographies of these mothers. While each text alone offers limited insight into the broader topic of motherhood, collectively they reveal various aspects of the mothering experience. Combining these sources provides a rough picture of what motherhood might have meant for individual Tibetan Buddhist women at various points between the 13th and 18th centuries. Interestingly, the hagiography of a Buddhist master written by a woman mentions the mother's activities and qualities more frequently and more in detail than those written by men. It is possible that this woman played a significant role in her son's life, a fact that the male author would also have acknowledged. However, it is also possible that the more frequent depiction is due to the female authorship. In many cases, aspects of motherhood were only mentioned in passing. At the same time, this highlights the significant challenges of motherhood, such as meeting expectations while pursuing one's own spiritual path and playing a supporting role without disappearing entirely. The idea of not getting lost can be applied at various contexts, including as an individual, as a mother, as part of communities and cultural memory, and as part of religious narratives. The excerpts from their lives described before reveal that motherhood could be highly individual and complex, and that it was experienced differently in different social religious contexts. Given that mothers are usually the most important person in a child's life and are ideally revered throughout their lives, it is surprising how little has been recorded about them. Much of what has been written corresponds to an idealized picture of a mother, featuring good qualities, the miraculous childbirth of a religiously significant son, and the loving, selfless care that he and other living beings receive. This again testifies to the aspired position and role of a mother, to be compassionate and loving, yet remain in the background. These are only brief insights into the lives of women, the lives of mothers. So what makes a good mother? Which qualities define a good mother, whether in the past or present, in Tibet, Germany, or anywhere else in the world? Opinions in this differ greatly. Many women want children only to realize at some point that they are overwhelmed by all the expectations and workload involved. However, they rarely speak out about it because it simply isn't talked about. Accordingly, the image of mothers in Tibetan Buddhism that I have presented today is only a small excerpt. It offers a brief insight into the past and another culture, no more nor less. However, it is important to consider such areas or parts of social life. I hope that more and more women will emerge from the shadows of history and be given a voice. We have come a long way, yet in many parts of the world the voices still go unheard, and little has been recorded about them. Becoming a mother and the experience of being one is by no means self-evident, even though it is often treated as such. And as long as women's voices and women's stories are missing from narratives, a part of our collective memory will also be missing. Thank you for your attention.